The people we talk to, they all have a kind of, because they would now, have an early memory of the first time they heard about Putin, or the story they heard about Putin, or when they perceived that this little gray guy was a comer in the Yeltsin world. How about you?
The first time anybody mentioned Putin to me was a casual remark by one of our diplomats in St. Petersburg consulate, who mentioned that he had a good relationship with the deputy mayor who seemed to be a good fixer. And that was Putin. I didn't think much of it. I mean, glad you have a good contact, that's great. In those days, St. Petersburg had a progressive reputation in a Russian context. That's the first I ever heard of him. Later, when he started his rise in Moscow, of course, his name came up. And I remember I was in Poland when Yeltsin resigned and basically named Putin as his successor. The story going around was that Putin and Yeltsin had made a deal. Yeltsin would name Putin, and Putin would protect Yeltsin's family from action on the corruption charges or the corruption allegations that had been made. That's what I knew. And then early Putin seemed to present himself as a tough-minded, business-like, cut-to-the-chase guy who could make the system work. That's an impression. I'm not giving you a deep analysis, but that's the impression people had.
Let me back up for just a minute. Russia under Yeltsin, the end of the Soviet Union, America's perception, Clinton's perception of Yeltsin, and how it just kind of, how it was at the end.
Oh, sure. Well, we made a miscalculation about Yeltsin, but it was one that was made honestly. That is, we saw Yeltsin on the tank, facing down the coup plotters, pushing back against neo-Soviet forces in the summer of 1991, and that was a heroic moment. And he seemed to have captured the support of the Russian people, and it seemed to a lot of us that Russia really might go the way of Poland. That is, it might regard itself as liberated from the outside, the alien yoke of communism, which was an argument Solzhenitsyn used to make all the time, and find its way back to its pre-revolutionary identity as a rapidly converging European power. Now, right now that sounds wildly optimistic, but think about it. Russia really was a convergence power, converging with Europe in the last decades before the revolution. It was a leader in Europe and Western art, music, philosophy, science, drawing near with the West on engineering, its economy rapidly growing. It's easy to see that if World War I and the Russian Revolution hadn't intervened, Russia would be a very different place. So the argument went, if the Russians can overthrow communism, can they find their way back to the path they had been going on?
When in that process does it become obvious that Yeltsin's not going to be the guy that carries that?
Well, it depends on whom you talk to.
I'm talking to you.
The first time I heard a serious analyst start shaking her head and saying that Yeltsin's not the guy we think he is was when he fired on the White House. Do you remember? I mean, the Russian government building during the political standoff. And this analyst said, look, I know that most of Washington is backing him because he's facing down a bunch of neo-Soviet reactionaries, but still, this is unconstitutional and Russia will regret it. It shows us that what we think we're dealing with is not what we're really dealing with. Now, that was early. I think that was 93. And I just pocketed away. I remember it. It's 24 years later. I remember that analyst saying, watch out, don't fool yourself. After that, though, we kept trying to work with Yeltsin, and the Clinton administration, to its credit, got a lot done. It helped stabilize the Russian economy. We did help the Russians. We did invite Russia to become kind of an ally of the alliance, as Sandy Vershbow used to call it. The NATO-Russia relationship would be the alliance with the alliance. So we were building a strategic framework to bring Russia into the family of nations through the 90s. But after the 96 elections, with the devil's bargain of getting election money from the oligarchs in return for their ownership of state assets, and then later with Yeltsin's health deteriorating, inflation, financial crisis, it became clear that the Russia we thought we were dealing with was not the Russia we actually had. Enter Putin. So Putin comes in, and his argument, and the argument of people around him speaking to us, serious people, was, look, after the degradation of the Russian state and difficulties of the 90s, you need a strong ruler who is going to reassemble the Russian state and to modernize it. And on this basis, be able to deal with you, not from a position of supplicant, which is unsustainable politically. Now, those are my words, but that's a basic summary of the argument we were hearing on behalf of Putin.
Did he pretty much need to make the case that he should be president of the United States?
Well,
I'm not taking publicly, but...
Strobe Talbot had a very skeptical view of Putin, and Putin was doing things in 2000, the end of the Clinton administration, which I believe caused Strobe and others to start questioning where they were headed. And it was a harbinger, it was a foretaste of things to come. Pulling out of an arms control arrangements. I believe something to do with Iran. It's a long time ago. But at the time, when Bush comes in, he and Condi Rice are willing to deal with Putin at face value with one big caveat. They never, ever sacrificed other countries on the altar of good relations with Russia. It was about a bit of a hedging of their bets. So if they got it wrong, they wouldn't be wrong at somebody else's expense, which means it was basically an honorable policy. And I was part of it. I'm not trying to distance myself from it. There was a sense, and this was solidified during the famous Bush-Putin meeting in Slovenia in June 2001, that you could do business with Putin, that Putin was going to be a kind of strong ruler modernizer in the Russian tradition, but not anti-Western, not someone who would trash the rule of law, not someone who would act in opposition to the West, but someone who would try to get Russia ready to work with the West. Now, in retrospect, it's easy to say, boy, you guys really got it wrong. But at the time, we were dealing with what we had.
Sure, and I think the question is, when you went to school, when you read the book on who is Putin, what was it that Condi, you, and others saw that led you to those conclusions? What was it about him that you thought you knew or had heard about or had seen?
Well, in the Soviet period, some of the more insightful KGB people actually understood the depths to which the Soviet Union had fallen. Andropov, no liberal, also understood that things couldn't go on the way they were. And it was possible that Putin was aware of the need for reform of the system, that he was not a committed liberal or human rights guy, hardly, being KGB, but it was possible that he understood the need for a strong state, meaning strong rule of law.
Because
now, that's not how it turned out, you understand?
Sure, but because he was a KGB guy, it was a plus.
Well, no, it wasn't a plus,
Okay.
but it was not necessarily disqualifying. Now people look back and say, well, organizational affiliation is destiny. Once KGB, always KGB. Okay, right, I get that. But at the time, you could argue that the insight the KGB had into the system, that is, dealing with real information, gave them the basis to understand that the system had to be reformed in order to be saved. Now, again, these assumptions turned out to be wrong, but it was worth a try, and the reason I'm defending the early Bush policy is because Bush never, ever stopped working with Central Europe, and he never tried to buy Russian friendship by sacrificing other countries. And that was Bush's version of what Clinton was doing, which pretty much the same thing. That is, support EU enlargement, enlarge NATO to the countries that are ready, and at the same time work with Russia. Oh, and no real military or no military buildup at all in Central Europe in the new NATO countries, but keep that military level low in the hopes that the Russians would understand that this was not a foretaste of some arms race. So it was actually a complicated policy, a mixed one, and it was wrong. But, if Bush hadn't done it and if Clinton hadn't done it, you would ask me the legitimate question, well, why didn't you even try? To which I would have no answer. So I'm glad we tried. And the failure is principally a failure of Russia to take advantage of the opportunities Clinton and Bush opened up to it.
Let's talk a little bit about the personalities, the Bush personality, the Putin personality, the way they both, from what I can tell as a former KGB man, he would have studied Bush dramatically and known the cross story and all of that. And Bush would have had a book from you guys and others about who is Putin and what is the KGB and where did he come from. So those two people meet, and as I hear the story, they go privately into a room for about 45 minutes.
I think they walked around. I remember them walking around outside also.
Okay.
It was Slovenia. It's Brdo Castle, great location. I'm standing next to Condi. Putin comes in, and his body language was all positive and sunny and, kind of open. And I think I whispered to her, this is going to be really good, and she nods. You could just tell. And they seemed to hit it off right away. Putin was all business, but not in a bad way. He was, look, we're the guys. Let's make deals. Let's sort out our relations. We want to work with you. Bush is a shrewd judge of people. He wants to know who you are, where you as a person are coming from. He sort of liked what he saw or what he thought he saw. And fair enough, right? Putin was leaning forward in his best way. And Bush had just been to Warsaw. And he'd given a speech, which if you read it, sounds like he's telling people, and we're going to keep enlarging NATO, and we're going to expand freedom. It's the Bush freedom agenda without the Iraq War and before 9/11. So he's done this. He's staked out a position, and then he meets Putin, and Putin's glad to see him. So Bush has not given away anything. He's taken the policy high ground, and then is in a position to really welcome Putin as a potential partner. I thought that was pretty clever. Of Bush. This was Bush and Rice figuring this out. I was in the NSC at the time. So I think this was a good beginning. Now, you're going to say, yeah, but it all failed.
No, I'm not.
Well, I look, it did end up badly.
Well, I'm going to walk you through ways that it might have failed.
It was worth the try. And it's always important with the Russians never to give up on trying to establish a positive agenda for two reasons. One, you might succeed. And two, even if you don't succeed, you don't want to be open to the charge that you never tried. But important rule of Russian policy, policy toward Russia, don't sacrifice somebody else's country and think it's a gesture of goodwill which will be reciprocated. It will be seen as a gesture of weakness, and you'll lose.
So the moment comes where they're talking to the press, and the question gets asked to the president, what do you think, or whatever the question is.
Yeah.
You're sitting there next to Condi.
In back of her.
Take me there. Tell me what you were hoping he would say, and tell me how you reacted.
Well, I'm sitting there, and as I remember, I'm sitting next to John Byerly, who was later our ambassador and the best Russian speaker in the entire U.S. Foreign Service. And Bush gives that line, right? That I looked into his eyes and got a sense of his soul. And John and I sort of look at each other and go, uh-oh. And Condi does her version of not comfortable. She just reacts. Her back stiffens just for a second. If you didn't know her, if you weren't watching, you would have missed it. I think she felt she should have prepared Bush for that question. But, even though it's a famous line that people, kid him about, it's not a bad sentiment to have. Yeah, you look back at Putin and you're wrong. That was wrong. But in the context, that is, reaching out to Putin, it didn't actually give away anything. It set the groundwork for I'll trust you until you prove otherwise. And then Putin proved otherwise, and President Bush responded accordingly. But I'm not going to criticize that line, even though it's been much criticized. Again, that's in the category of worth a try, even if you're wrong, as long as you don't sacrifice your values or your interests.
Putin picks up the phone on 9/11 and reaches Condi and talks to her about it. Do you know why he did that and what he was hoping it would yield?
I don't know, and I'll never say I know what Putin was thinking. I wasn't on Air Force One, so I don't know the details of that, but I know that in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, Putin was leaning forward, offering to be helpful. He made it clear that he would not oppose the U.S. establishing temporary military bases to support the operation in Afghanistan, and we really thought in the Bush administration that counterterrorism would be the rock-solid foundation on which we and Russia would build a new relationship, that we would use arms control to settle the last remnants of the Cold War. Counterterrorism in a post-9/11 era would make us rock-solid allies, and that the notion we would increase, we would thicken, so to speak, the NATO-Russia relationship, which Bush did in the spring of 2002, the Pratica de Mare NATO summit in Italy. So we would strengthen the relationship with Russia, between Russia and NATO. We would build anti-terrorist cooperation, and at the same time, we would continue the policy of NATO enlargement and support EU enlargement. That's how we entered the post-9/11 period, trying to do sort of more with the Russians without sacrificing our other objectives.
The people we talk to say what Putin desperately needed, wanted, would have done anything for, was respect from the United States on a kind of world stage, that he really felt the nation, his audience, his base felt diminished, broken, and they looked to him not only for security but for status in the world, in the worldview. And that what he really wanted from America was to be shown in some important ways that respect, and that the thing that tears it for them first, for them, was Iraq.
Well, we were aware that Putin wanted this, and Bush was giving it to him. I mean, brought Russia into the G8, expanded the NATO-Russia relationship. Don't forget, in November 2001, after 9/11, Bush brings Putin down to the Crawford Ranch. I was there for that. And it was wonderful. The atmosphere was terrific.
What were they like together?
They seemed to get along. Putin, let us say because of his training, is good at being kind of buddies with somebody if he wants to be. He can be quite charming. The whole reception with the Tex-Mex the Texas music, and some dancing, and a whole easy, relaxed atmosphere was terrific. And I remember a Russian deputy foreign minister turned to me, watching the president and Putin chatting in a kind of animated way, said, "You're just getting to know him, and we're just getting to know him too." And I said, well, here's to both of us. I'm giving you this as a sense of the atmosphere. I don't think that Russian deputy foreign minister was being arch. I think he was sincere, and we saw some real possibilities. Like I said, it didn't turn out that way, but I'm not a believer in inevitability. I don't think it was doomed. I think there were other possibilities. Now, the Iraq War, okay? You had this huge split, very emotional, between the U.S. And Britain on one side, also Spain and Poland on one side, and Germany, France, and then Russia on the other. And this was painful and damaging. Now, whatever you think of the Iraq War, pro or con, I think both Chirac and Schroeder used that debate to promote their own domestic political standing by taking anti-American postures. Now, a critic of the Iraq War would say, yeah, well, we deserved it, they were right, we were wrong, and maybe so. But I'm talking about at the time. This isn't a discussion of Iraq, but of Russia relations. We saw Putin suddenly look and evaluate the split within the Western alliance. And you had Chirac and Schroeder appealing to him to come on their side, to box in Bush and Blair. And you could feel Putin tempted by this. And then he got a taste for it. He liked it. Now, this is without prejudice to the merits of the Iraq War, but this is the fallout. And I don't think the split over the Iraq War was dispositive, but I think it was too bad. Now, it did not destroy the U.S.-Russia relationship, and in particular, it didn't destroy Bush's and Condi Rice's efforts to keep working with the Russians. I remember she took this rather philosophically, as if to say, look, the Russians are still going to play around. We shouldn't let this throw us or exact revenge. It was a very measured, collected response to what Putin was doing.
Do you guys know by then it's 4, 5? He's had the little beginnings of the color revolutions. Do you know he's taken the television stations? He's
I
started
was going to raise that.
Right. So he's starting to act an awful lot like, the guy we might fear.
Like Putin, like the Putin we know. Well, we notice this. I was going to say, when Putin moves against NTV and pushes out Gusinski, we were alarmed by this. And we tried to find ways to dissuade Putin from this course. And we were trying to think creatively of ways to support independent Russian broadcasting without interfering. You can't give U.S. government money to it, and we weren't tempted by that. But Putin started taking down the independent mass media, and that was a bad sign. And earlier than a lot of people realize, Bush himself, I think, began to reevaluate his initial assessment of Putin. I remember a conversation between Bush and Blair in, I think it was October 2003, after the Iraq War. It's in London. Bush is going to London. There were big anti-American or anti-Bush demonstrations. And I remember it was over a lunch, I think it was a lunch, that Bush and Blair, off script, started talking about Putin. And the two of them had the same view. They were groping toward, I can't say had reached, but they were thinking through Putin the same way. It was striking. And they were saying to each other, I'm not sure he's the guy we thought he was. I'm worried about this throttling of the independent media. This is not good. This is not the guy we were signing up to help. and bring into kind of our inner circle of world leadership. They didn't draw any conclusions, but it was a striking conversation, and it was not in the talking points. This isn't staff generated. This was two leaders thinking about the guy. Remember I said earlier, Bush had a good feel for people, a good sense of where they're coming from. And it was both leaders saying to each other, hey, we don't like this. This was early. This was before Condi Rice or Powell or Blair's people were there. And I just it struck me at the time. I thought, wow, this is interesting.
Take me to, there's the Beslan moment, which seems like total carnage, of course, but it also feels like a hint that if you're Bush and you're trying to evaluate somebody and you're worried about his autocratic tendencies, and suddenly you see the press being taken down or the TV being taken down, and then there's this moment. You've been talking about how to handle counterterrorism anyway, and here this guy goes full-chested, boom, right in there. Is there an effect of all of that on you guys?
We were horrified, genuinely on a human level, by the terrorist attacks in Russia, Beslan and the theater in Moscow. This was bad stuff. And there was a lot of human sympathy for the Russians. But this was a period of growing concern about what Putin was really doing and who he really was, at the same time that we were trying to keep the relationship together and organized. And all through this time, we're still working on ways to stabilize the relationship, ways to find a common positive agenda. But it's getting harder. We didn't know what was going to happen. We were still plugging away. But there was a kind of steady growing concern as this authoritarianism rises. And then, of course, we get the color revolutions. And that was a turning point, much more than the Iraq War. We did not appreciate at the time that Putin actually thought we were behind it, because we knew we weren't. I remember we were dumbfounded. I remember hearing about the Rose Revolution in Georgia, and I'm getting on a plane in Paris, and my deputy was saying, "Look, there's real trouble at the parliament. This guy Saakashvili's, pushing things pretty hard." I get on the plane, I land, phone him, and he says, "Well, it's over." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, Shevardnadze's fled, Saakashvili's in." What did I miss? We didn't know. And we didn't understand what was going to happen with the Orange Revolution. No idea. Putin thought we did. He thought we were the puppet masters. Man, we are not that good. We are not that good. I even told Russian television once, when they were accusing me personally of being the gray cardinal of the color revolutions, I said, I wish. How come you see America with a massive budget being unable to do anything much to stop the political deterioration and security deterioration in Iraq, and you think on no budget at all we can overthrow Moscow-supported governments in Kyiv and Tbilisi? Are you kidding me? But they really thought we were doing it.
Well, he's increasingly paranoid, right, about the idea. He is not somebody, as people tell us, he's not somebody who can comprehend grassroots rising up.
Here's a story. Here's a Soviet story. It's World War II. And Anna Akhmatova, the great poet of the pre-revolutionary period, the Silver Age, is going around, to Russian cities with all these refugees from Western Russia, living in miserable, hungry conditions and worked to the bone and fearful for their country, and she's reading poetry. And the message to these Russians is, we're still alive, and our culture's still here. We're still here, despite it all. And she's getting rapturous ovations in World War II. And news of this goes to Stalin, and he says, and who organized these spontaneous applause. Right? Putin, in one of the recent call-in shows, is asked, some Russian asks him, what about official corruption? And Putin says, who told you to ask that question? He's channeling Stalin. He's channeling Stalin. Think about it. Stalin couldn't believe that the Russian people would embrace one of the great Russian poets of the 20th century in World War II. He had no comprehension of why. And this is still a characteristic of Russian rulers. There is no such thing as society. It's all manipulation. It's rather chilling if you think about it.
What do you make of the 2007 Munich speech? Were you there?
I wasn't. My deputy, Kurt Volker, phoned me, and I remember he was chuckling, saying, this is not going to surprise you, but it seems to have surprised everybody else. He said that Bob Gates was taking it philosophically. Other Americans were pissed, frantic, angry. But he laid it out for me, and we could see it. We could see this building. This was, it's a good moment to mark a change. It's Putin's organized expression of his anti-Western agenda, one he has held for the last 10 years. And it's coming out of all of his frustrations and the color revolution and the sense that Russia was never going to get from the West what it wanted, which was a sphere of domination, because no one was going to give Russia a sphere of domination over its neighbors. Like, been there, done that. Now, if Harry Truman wasn't going to give it to Stalin, and if even Roosevelt at the end of his life regretted what he had done at Yalta, what makes you think that now we're going to give away the same countries? And I think Putin had enough with Russia trying to be a normal nation. Russia wants to be a nation that makes its own rules and is surrounded by satellites. And they measure all countries by their own measure. And I think, therefore, they do not understand the West, they don't understand NATO, they don't understand the EU, because they think that it has to be dominated either by the US or Germany, and that all the arrangements to support the powers and prerogatives of smaller countries are mere scaffolding for power, because that's the way they see things. They really don't understand the American system, the free world. And Putin clearly in this speech was drawing a line and saying, we're not going to try anymore. We're just giving up on you, and we're going to make our own world in which we are the master.
And 2 months later, they hit Estonia. Denial of service, all the stuff, all the first real effective cyber attack.
Well, at this point, a lot of us, at this point, I was becoming known as a Russia hawk. Okay? I had been totally behind the outreach to Russia. I was there. And I was comfortable with reaching out to Russia in this middle period where we had growing doubts, but there's a good argument to be made for a positive agenda. By late 2006, I've got my doubts, and now I'm hawkish. So that reputation I have is fair as of about 2007. And we're watching this stuff. And we're watching the tension build. And we were thinking, Georgia, Ukraine, the Baltics, they are now in the crosshairs. And Putin's appetite has only grown in the 10 years since. It's quite ugly and dangerous. Putin has started 2 wars, Georgia and Ukraine. And he has gone after the United States, he's gone after France, he continues to spread money around throughout Europe. It's bad. But in 2007, you could see that this was coming. And it was the Bush administration, to its enormous credit, continued this dual-track policy of doing the best we could with Russia, but not sacrificing other countries. We can debate whether we chose the right tactic by fighting in NATO over a membership action plan for Georgia and Ukraine in 2008. But as a strategic concept, what we were trying to do is still basically the right thing.
Hadley famously says, I think we threw Russia, maybe he said the French in us or the British in us or somebody in us, threw Russia in the toilet. This is the end of the Bush administration. What do you mean by that?
Well, Steve Hadley is one of these policymakers who is always looking for a way forward. I mean, it's his greatest gift. You give him an impossible situation, and he's going to try to find some way to fix it. And it's wonderful. And he's very good at it. I wouldn't put it that way. I think, though, that we made some pretty tough decisions that the Russians didn't like. Kosovo is one of them. That is Kosovo independence in February 2008. The Russians hated that. And serious people have said to me that that might have been a precipitating factor in the Russian decision to invade Georgia. But here's my counter to that. Russia had sentimental attachment to Serbia and therefore was opposed to Kosovo's independence. Sentiment, hell. We had troops on the ground. And we had troops who had arrived to liberate Kosovo from Serb atrocities and were stuck with the UN basically management of Kosovo, which was failing, becoming more unpopular. And you think I'm going to sit around as a policymaker and let us slide from being liberators to occupiers with the ground burning at our feet? Hell no. Back around 2004, some of us had decided that we had to make decisions about Kosovo's future, and that turned out to be independence. And we did so with almost all, though not all, of the European Union countries. Now, should we have stopped short of independence and kept the UN mandate there so as not to hurt Russia's feelings? Hey, their feelings are troops. Oh, yes, not to mention the actual Kosovars themselves. Do they get a vote in their own future? Or are they to be sacrificed to avoid hurting Russia's feelings? Now, I'm putting it in rather arch terms, but I'm trying to clarify for you the policy choices we actually faced. So you come in and tell me that Russia won't like it, and I'm telling you that you won't like the results unless we act. Choose. And I remember there was an NSC meeting, not just a principals committee meeting. It was President George W. Bush in the chair, making the final decision about Kosovo independence. And he made sure, he asked me and others to present the downsides. And I said, look, here are all the downside risks. Everybody knew them. Gates, Rice, they all knew. But it turned out okay. I mean, Kosovo's independence turned out to be a lot more viable than South Sudan's. Not bad. And a lot better off than it would be if we hadn't. I went into detail so you'd understand that when somebody comes to you and say, well, we really stepped on the Russians' feet because of Kosovo, you have an idea that there were actual equities that have nothing to do with Moscow and its hurt feelings.
Did President Bush know it was going to piss off the Russians? Did you tell him?
That came up? Sure.
And what did he say?
I mean, we all understood this. The Russians aren't going to like it. And it was kind of, well, what happens if we don't? Okay, well, sir, this is how it likely unravels. We had just stabilized Iraq because of the surge. So I'm telling the president, you're going to have an indigenous population that is really mad at American soldiers because we've betrayed them and now we're occupiers. How's that sound to you, sir? Does that sound like a good idea?
Okay.
Now, I didn't have to, there was no need to tell President Bush, and Condi Rice laid it out. I mean, that kind of wonderful analytic mind she has, where she will walk you through a problem with clarity. There wasn't anything she didn't know. And similarly, on the decision for a membership action plan for Georgia, President made this call himself, and he knew that it was risky. He knew the alliance was divided. He knew Putin wouldn't like it, and he knew that there were tough. This was not an easy one. There were real equities at stake. In retrospect, if I had known that Angela Merkel would have been unmovable, maybe I would have come out a different way. Maybe. But it was only a membership action plan. It wasn't membership. Nobody was asking about membership. These were some of the tough issues we had to decide. And Steve Hadley is always throughout this period trying to do the right thing about Russia. He was one of these people who was trying to find ways to cooperate with Russia on missile defense. And his ideas were good. I mean, these were win-win solutions that Hadley would think through and try to get through the system. And they were the right ideas.
Tell me about the notion of the reset. It's Obama and Clinton. Putin is now the prime minister of Russia. Medvedev is the president of Russia.
Yeah.
Do we know that this is a joke? Or
the tandem.
Right.
The tandem. Well, there were some who believed that the tandem was real, possibly because they wanted to believe it. It was a little like the Clinton people believing Yeltsin could really pull something off. You want to believe it. It clearly, you said the tandem was a sham. And of course it was. Of course it was. But there was this hope that Medvedev represented the 21st century. And this policy failed, and it was based on a mistaken assumption, but this Obama policy is like the Clinton policy and like the Bush policy. You're failing, but you're doing so honorably, and you're trying for a good reason. Like, I'm not going to sit back here and bust them and say, oh, they were foolish, because the Obama administration, even though it put too much faith in the tandem, didn't sacrifice other countries. The equities we played with were our own, and it was worth a try. I was with Secretary Clinton when she gave that reset button to Lavrov. I didn't object. I didn't object at the time, and I'm not going to go back and object.
Take me in there. What was that? How did that go?
Well,
whose idea was it?
It was Vice President Biden who first used the word reset. And I'll say something for Joe Biden's framing of Russia relations in his Munich Security Conference speech. He used reset, and in the same speech, he also said, no Russian veto over NATO enlargement and no recognition of south of Ossetia and Abkhazia, the two Georgian provinces Russia had grabbed. And so Biden was limiting the reset. And I thought, wow, this guy is good. Now, I was there. I was on this trip. But this is all Biden. It was Mike McFaul, Tony Blinken, and myself were on the plane, but it was Biden who's working this out. And he just nailed it. He just nailed it. Reset, but not with somebody else's country. So an honorable policy. And so when Clinton's going to give the reset button to Lavrov, look, I get it. It's an attempt to take some of the rancor out of the relationship so we can work together in areas where we agree.
What is the reset button? What do you mean the reset button?
Oh, don't you remember this? There was a big button, misspelled in Russian, which said reset, only it was misspelled. Because it was Перегрузка in Russian, which we thought meant reset, which means overload. Перезагрузка means reset. Now, my Russian's a little rusty, and I trusted somebody else. I won't say who. I trusted somebody else because, Polish was my best language at the time. And so misspell, that might have been a prophetic, but it was still.
It's what? It's the.
Yeah, it's this plastic button. It says reset, and it was kind of a gag gift, but it was also symbolic of what Hillary Clinton's trying to do. And when, in retrospect, it was very similar to what Bush did, and very similar to what Clinton is doing. That is, American presidents who are trying to make things right with Russia. And even though they failed, these are honorable efforts.
But what does Lavrov do when he looks at that?
He laughs. He laughs, and he points out that it's misspelled, but he takes it in good spirit. And it's a perfectly good meeting. I think it's in Geneva. And I was still in my old job as assistant secretary. And Hillary Clinton's approach to the Russians at this time, I think she said it to me like in the corridor once. It's Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold. Let's hit it right down the middle. Well, fair enough. Every administration ought to take a look at ways we can improve things in Russia. I think that the Trump administration's entitled to do the same, as long as it doesn't give away somebody else's country or give Putin unilateral presence.
During that time period, we're in 8 to 11. The thing that seems significant is, of course, Arab Spring to Libya. It just feels like that lights up for Putin himself. He's seeing popular uprisings, seeing despots go out the window, seeing the United States encouraging, throwing Mubarak under the bus or whatever he sees.
But that's,
I understand, but this is his eyes, and he's seeing it, and he's saying...
No, I know. But I can't help, I have to object when somebody says it would be more realistic to put our support behind an 80-plus-year-old guy. Like, really? But the Obama administration is grappling with the Arab Spring. And it's wrestling with these different objectives: stability versus democracy, short-term versus long-term. The problem of electoral democracy when you don't have other institutions of a modern state in place. All of these problems. And they're grappling honestly with a set of hard problems. But Putin doesn't see this. He sees this as the United States trampling around, overthrowing his kind of guys, which are dictators, in the name of some ephemeral thing that he doesn't believe in called democracy. So he hates it. He just hates it, still does. If I had to give a sentence to describe Russian foreign policy, it's this: Putin wants to make the world safe for Russian autocracy, which means compromising every democratic center of power he can find and crushing democracy closer to home, like Ukraine. It's a pretty cynical appraisal, and it's not new. Go back to the early 19th century, where Russia was crushing liberal revolutions in Budapest and Warsaw because the Russians were afraid that they could success in these countries would infect Russia. Sound familiar? Yeah. That's a lot of what's going on. And that kind of approach to the world is a function of the failure of Russian reform at home. So instead of reform at home, you do expansion abroad, the better to keep away the alien ideas and show your people who's master of the universe. And when that fails, and only when that fails in Russian history, has Russia turned to internal reform. But when it does, it often succeeds. And that gets me back to the Russia the 2 generations before the Russian Revolution. Liberal czars, reactionary czars, weak czars, Nicholas II. Nevertheless, Russia was developing in a European direction. So I'm not one of these people who believes that Russia is civilizationally apart or different. Condi Rice's book Democracy talks about this, and she's right. She's right. Don't write off the Russians as if they're alien. That's the Sam Huntington approach. Civilizational differences, culture is destiny. Come on. Really? That's retrospective inevitability. Things are the way they are because they could be no other way. You think? When you're a policymaker, you see a multiple of opportunities, and if things are inevitable, how come inevitability never works projecting it forward? Only backwards. So for Russia, that means that it's in one of these periods of internal backwardness and lack of reform, and therefore hostility to the world, which produces a downward spiral of lack of reform and corruption at home, and hostility to the world that forces Russia to, it thinks, increase the repression. That cycle is broken or can be broken when Russia fails. Now, changing Russia's policy internally is not our business. It's not our responsibility. And I'm not saying that this should be a policy objective. It's beyond what we can do. But as a student of history, that's sort of a reality you got to keep in mind. I'm really amused sometimes when the Russians say there is an infinite capacity in the Russian soul for suffering. Nothing you can do can affect us. Well, the Russian capacity for suffering was proven in World War II. That's true. And in 1812, we look through that war through the eyes of Tolstoy. A similar kind of thing, a national resistance to an outside invader. But what about all those wars Russia lost? Crimea War, Russo-Japanese War, World War I? Germany beat Russia in World War I, and Russia was saved ultimately by the United States. That saved Russia. And that suggests to me that Russia's capacity for suffering is enormous when Russia is truly menaced by an outside aggressor. Not when the government says they are, but when the people know they are, and there's a difference.
Let's talk for a minute, Daniel, about the 2011 street protests and how Putin reads that. He's made the announcement he's going to run again, and the people hit the streets. It's the moment where Hillary says whatever she says, and he remembers it forever and ever and ever as the United States interfering with his policies.
Sakes. It's all Stalin, and who organized this spontaneous applause for Anna Akhmatova. Yeah? The Russians have an inability to recognize that not everything is manipulation. Not everything is spin. Not everything is fakery. Not everything is a Potemkin village. There is reality out there. And Russian society has its own views. They're not going to be swayed by America. They're not going to be swayed by the Kremlin ultimately. They're going to look around like people do everywhere. Nothing special about that. But I do believe Putin was somehow convinced that Hillary Clinton was behind this, and convinced that Toria Nuland was behind the Maidan, my colleague and successor as Assistant Secretary of State. Oh, just nonsense. Hillary Clinton is the muse that inspires the Russian demonstrations? Give me a break. We don't have that power as Americans. All we have as Americans is the power of an ideal that we hold up and occasionally represent. But if people are taking to the street, they're doing it so because they want to, not because we tell them to.
The phone call that is wiretapped or whatever it is and then released. Talk to me about that. Why was that even anything anybody is still talking about?
if you're familiar with Toria's style, well, she has her own, and she's famous for it. That's the way she talks. But it was, to me, when I heard that, I just laughed. You think that European diplomats on the cell phone don't say similar things about the Americans and how difficult we can be? Of course they do. Of course they do. It means they're just letting off some steam and frustration. Big deal. Nobody cares.
So why did the Russians release it?
Because they wanted to embarrass her.
Why?
Well, I have a theory for which I have no evidence but simply observations. I've noticed that the Russians really have problems with strong, capable women. Think about it. Hillary Clinton, Toria Nuland, Angela Merkel, maybe Condi Rice too. It just seems to set them on edge that these women in positions of power who are deeply knowledgeable and intensely competent are able and have, in the Russian eyes, the effrontery to stand up to them and just hold their ground. I've noticed that. Just sort of a pattern. And I think a lot of the women who have dealt with the Russian officialdom over the years, and there are a lot of senior American diplomats and others, like Madeleine Albright, who know the Russians well and are not going to be fooled. So I think they may have just wanted to slap her down.
Yeah. We'll generally skip the ins and outs of the Ukraine-Crimea moment. But there is, in fact, an argument about arming the Ukrainians.
Sure.
A pretty intense argument.
Sure there is.
That President Obama finally
That's right.
Makes his announcement. Where are you on that argument? What do you believe?
What was
we
my
should
own
have done?
position?
Yeah.
Well, I wasn't part of the decision-making apparatus. Right. At the time, I was just the sanctions guy. As the sanctions guy, I would prefer that sanctions not be the only pillar on which our policy rests. Like, I'm glad to be kind of the center of policy making, but come on, give me some company here. Don't put it all on sanctions. So I was for it. I think Strobe, Talbot, and others outside government had the stronger case. But it's not a 100-0 case. There were arguments on the other side. You're going to escalate. You don't have escalatory dominance. The Russians can arm more. Then you're going to be held responsible. The Europeans don't want to do this. So there are arguments on the other side. I still think the argument for giving the Ukrainians the means to defend themselves, particularly against Russian armor, against tanks, is compelling. I think we should have done it. But, okay, look, the Obama administration, I think, in the end, should get a lot of credit for the way it responded to Russia's aggression generally. Look what it did. Heavy sanctions against Russia, the diplomacy to sustain it, NATO decision to put brigade strength forces into the Baltics and Poland, reversing 25 years of American drawdown. That's a pretty big decision. That's Obama. That's more than Bush did after the Georgian War. So give the Obama people some credit. You know, Dennis McDonough, Rice, the president himself had to sign off on all these things, and they did. As a known hawk on Russia, you know, I might have pushed for more, but I'm not going to knock people who have ultimate responsibility for the decisions. And I think the Obama-Russia policy, like Bush's, stands up pretty well.
Yeah. After Trump wins, in that month, in that 2 months, November and December, mid-November into December, all kinds of back channels are trying to be created. All kinds of conversations are going back and forth. We hear about them, the Mike Flynn phone calls with Kislyak, back and forth. In your experience in the State Department over all these administrations, has anything like this happened at this level in the transition period between presidencies?
There's nothing wrong with a transition team talking to ambassadors. They do it all the time. Campaigns do it. This is done. What's odd is not owning up to it. That was a little weird. Trying to do it in a secretive way. I don't understand that. There's nothing wrong with meeting with Ambassador Kislyak. It's a little odd that you would forget it. He's an interesting personality, strong person, smart. You don't forget that you've met with him. You remember it. I don't know anything more than has been in the newspapers, but given the atmosphere at the time, the emerging story of the Russian hacking into the DNC, the odd rhetorical deference the Trump campaign gave to Putin on all things, one would think that a transition team would be more careful. Now, I only know what I know, and I don't know anything that is out in the public press. But at the time, in the Obama administration, we were preparing these cyber sanctions in retaliation for the cyber hacking. These came out on December 29th. I think they should have been stronger. I think we needed more time to study the implications of what the Russians had done and come up with a more serious countermeasure. But it was the right thing to do nevertheless. And
But why couldn't it have been done was it being discussed in August or September?
Well, that's a fair question. I know that some of us in the State Department were discussing it, but there wasn't an organized interagency process until very late in the game.
Why?
I don't know. Maybe people didn't want to be seen as acting before the election because it would be seen as politicizing things. I don't know. I'm not the person to ask. I do know that we were puzzled and frustrated. I was able to do only a few things on my own authority, that not take action on my own authority, but start preparing for possible cyber sanctions, which I did, and some of these were implemented. But it would have been far more effective had the U.S. government decided to prepare stronger sanctions and look at some of the larger issues the Russian cyber hacking raised. We're finding out now that the Russian cyber hacking was more extensive than originally known. We had a suspicion it might be like that, and we're finding out that it really was like that. So this has to be laid at the feet of the Obama administration. I think they were cautious, perhaps overly so. In the end, they decided to do the right thing. I think we should have done more of it. But now the Trump administration has a problem, because not only is Russia not doing anything at all to merit a lifting of sanctions imposed because of Ukraine, but the extent of Russia's aggression through cyber is growing. Moreover, that's aggression not just directed against us. It seems to have been directed against the French elections as well. Now, if I'm not in government, but if I were, I would probably by now have been over to Brussels a couple of times, and Berlin and Paris, to discuss what we might do together. Because this is something the transatlantic alliance, the great democracies of the world should consult on, not act unilaterally.
You think that's happening?
I don't know. Well, there's no replacement for me so far. That is, there's no new coordinator for sanctions. There's no Assistant Secretary of State for Europe. The policy people at the European Bureau are really good. These are professional people, knowledgeable, skilled, competent. First-rate team at NSC. But I've not heard of it. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that we're in these kinds of discussions now.
Can you just describe the summer of 2016, and as it becomes apparent that the Russians are involved in the election. What's the feeling at State Department around you as you're watching, the leaks happening during the DNC? What's sort of the atmosphere and the reaction?
When this story started to break in the summer, as citizens, we were horrified and angry. As professionals, we wanted to start thinking about countermeasures. And this is also taking place when the Trump campaign was consistent and inexplicably soft on Putin. We couldn't figure this out. It didn't make a lot of sense. But professionally, we started thinking about, very early, about what we could do and should do.
You know this guy.
Which guy?
Putin.
Oh, I've met him a handful of times.
But I mean, here
I would
you
not presume.
All right, but you know about him, and you know what his motives are, and you know what his actions have been. Why is he doing this?
If I had to characterize it, I would say that Putin wants to make the world safe for Russian autocracy. Now, what that means is, close to home, he has to make sure that Ukraine's democratic and European vocation fails. Farther away from home, Putin wants to weaken the transatlantic alliance, and he wants to weaken the idea of democracy. He wants to compromise it. The better to protect his brand of autocracy. In the Soviet period, Soviets knew that the West was wealthier and freer than they were. They believed that there was a democratic system out there. Putin wants to tell them, no, there isn't. They're just like us. He wants to bury their hopes in an avalanche of cynicism. So by compromising our elections, or attempting to, it's not so much the result he wants. It's the sense that our elections and our democracy is in fact compromised, which is what he's after. The better for him to be able to say to his people, see, we're all alike. Better stick with me, because it's just one boss or another, and I'm the boss you know.